There was no well there in the salt flat, and I'd ride my horse by that, and I'd cross this, and I got some of that oil on me, and I never did get over wanting to find some oil.
That's a gusher.
And I went out and woke Bill up, and I said, man, we're millionaires.
I said, is the law pretty good? And he said, well, how high are you standing?
And she said, well, I'll tell you what to do, Mr. Weaver. Says, I'll be standing right there with my rifle, and says, I'll kill you.
A friend of mine named Art Chapey, who's an old oil finder here in South Texas, came into my office and said, the boom's over.
To get this kind of economic infusion is nothing less than manna from heaven. This is the moment that we've been dreaming about but never imagined.
Water has always been scarce on the semi-arid, brushy plains of South Texas. For as long as anybody can remember, ranchers have had to constantly search for enough water to keep their cattle alive. One such rancher was Mexican immigrant Juan Lopez Sáenz, who in 1854, while digging for water near Piedras Pintas in Duval County, found instead a gooey black substance. In disgust, he plugged up the hole and kept on digging, still hoping to find some precious H2O. He finally found it, and he found a use for the black stuff, too, lubricating his wagon wheels. Since that inauspicious beginning, a dramatic story has unfolded. A story of men with a lust for success and a devil-may-care attitude. Men who were willing to stake their futures on a chance to gain vast wealth, and who sometimes got failure instead. Those early wildcatters were at the vanguard of a host of others that would help build a new industry in the region. Drillers with their aptly named crews of roughnecks, geologists and seismologists who found the oil and gas, petroleum engineers who figured out the most profitable way to get it out of the ground, landmen who secured drilling rights from landowners, and the businessmen, the entrepreneurs, and financiers who made money for everybody, or lost it all.
If you hit, well, you're fine. You may get your money back. If you don't, well, it's down the drain.
I got in a bad streak, and I had dry hole after dry hole for a year, So I quit them.
I never mind dry holes. My grandfather told me that you could be wrong 90% of the time and still make a lot of money, and that's the way it worked out.
Wildcatting for oil is like a roll of the dice. It's a high-stakes, high-risk game. But these tough, gutsy men gambled their way to untold riches, or found financial ruin at the bottom of a dry hole. Some did both. Strike it rich with one venture, then lose it all on the next. There were those who called it quits when this happened. Others, undaunted, raised more money and went at it again. Such was the roller coaster life of the wildcatter in the South Texas oil patch.
There's two emotions that spur on the wildcatter. An instinct to gamble is satisfied. That is one of the things. And then the other is the chase. Maybe that's related to it. With the old cowboy pictures, you always had to have a chase. And You're chasing that elusive oil field, and this is part of the motivation.
You got to have a little gamble in you, but you better not have too much gamble. You better make sure that you can follow up on your obligations.
Juan Saenz was not one of those adventurers. He was simply a cattle raiser looking for water for his stock. Still, Saenz's accidental discovery did attract others to try their luck at nearby sites. In 1870, William Tenney moved from Corpus Christi to the town of Piedras Pintas near the Saenz Ranch. Tenney married Saenz's daughter and encouraged his new father-in-law to keep on looking for more oil. He finally struck out on his own, but was met with years of frustration. William Tenney never quite made it. Before he died in 1924, he waxed philosophical about his efforts.
I have been working, or pretending to do so, more in selling leases than working.
A poem found in Tenney's effects after his death strikes a plaintive note.
We wish we had someone to love us, a banker to make us a loan. This oil game's about got us busted and caused us to weep and moan. Tomorrow we go to the rancho. Goodbye to the well of our dreams. And that cold ranch house we will supper on nothing but goat meat and beans.
The Piedras Pintas finds had started stirring interest in oil exploration, but most drilling was still in pursuit of water. Early natural gas discoveries all too often resulted in blowouts, some of them in awesome displays of power. In 1916, at White Point near Corpus Christi, a gas blowout generated a roar that could be heard 15 miles away. 1,000 feet from the well, conversation was inaudible. The gas gushed 500 feet into the air, and when it ignited, the flames lit the night sky for miles around. When the well finally burned out, a huge crater 100 feet deep and 200 feet wide scarred the earth. After important oil discoveries upstate, one at Corsicana, the other, a spectacular gusher at Spindletop near Beaumont, the state of Texas was on the oil and gas map. Wildcatters spread across the state looking for the next big play. South Texas was fair game. And new discoveries popped up in fields from Corpus Christi to Laredo. Some of these finds came in time to supply Allied forces with much-needed gasoline that helped us win World War I. From the turn of the century until the early 1920s, a series of significant discoveries proved that South Texas was a region rich in oil and gas reserves.
South Texas has always been important, but it's usually been overshadowed by what's been going on in some other part of the state. Ironically, if that region had been in a separate state, it would have been one of the most important producing parts of the country. But in the context of Texas, it always got less attention because there was always something breaking, something big time breaking somewhere else, just when things were happening in South Texas.
What established South Texas as a fertile field for oil and gas exploration were the 1921 discoveries near Mirando City by O.W. Killam and the 1922 opening of the Luling field by Edgar Davis. If there was ever a model of vision and determination, it was O.W. Killam. His discovery in 1921 near Mirando City in Webb County excited the media and drew other drillers to the area near Laredo. Killam's young son Radcliffe often accompanied him to the drilling sites. One day, he took a friend.
I looked around and I looked up and I saw this thing gushing up over the derrick. And I told my friend, it's a gusher, so we rushed down back to the location. It was basically the Discovery Well in that South Texas area.
O.W. Killam was a very successful oil man, but he was also a great showman, a successful promoter. And part of his promotion was the black box, which his driller told me was empty, and the other was his geologist, whom he described as a one-armed Indian. Well, as Morris explained to me, his geologist could be anybody on the rig floor who really might get an arm behind his back and look one-armed. But when Killam was showing would-be investors around, he would take him out, point to the guy at the top of the rig who seemed to have one arm and had the other arm over his eyes, hand over his eyes, looking off in the direction to scout out oil for Killam. What Killam did was surface geology and trendology and so on, but he was also a very successful showman.
He used what he called doodlebugging, and one of the doodlebug methods he used was to have his driver drive him around the countryside, and when he saw someplace he thought might be the right place, well, he would tell the driver, stop the car. He'd get out and he'd shoot his shotgun up in the air, and then he'd put his hand up and listen to see what he heard echoing coming back from the shotgun going off. And if he didn't hear anything, he'd get back in the car and tell the driver, keep going, go someplace else. So he'd drive down the road a little ways until the driver stopped. He'd get out and he'd shoot his shotgun again. He'd listen to the echo he got from it. If he found something that had the right echo to him, why, he'd put a stick in or a flag in, and they'd come back and drill a well there.
When he couldn't sell his oil, Killam didn't give up. He built a pipeline and his own refinery and wound up exporting millions of barrels of oil. About the same time Killam struck pay dirt in Webb County, another new entrant into the oil game arrived on the South Texas scene. In 1922, Edgar Byram Davis discovered the Luling Branyan field, which has produced 150 million barrels and is still going. Davis was an eccentric New England businessman who would bring his remarkable expertise and incredible hulk to the oil patch.
See, when he hit Luling, he weighed 300 pounds, was 6 feet tall, and had a trunk strap for a belt. He knew nothing of machinery. He just thought if you drill down, the oil came up.
Davis did not fit the mold of the typical Texas wildcatter. He spoke several languages, sang, composed music, and played the piano. His artistic interest stretched all the way to Broadway.
Edgar B. Davis did sponsor a play that lasted 1 year on Broadway, and no one came.
Concurrent with Davis's successes at Luling, exploration near the Gulf Coast was beginning to yield results. And just as O.W. Killam and Edgar Davis turned Laredo and Luling into thriving communities, finds near the Gulf and in nearby regions in deep South Texas stirred the growth of Corpus Christi, Sinton, Refugio, and Alice. In 1923, the Saxet field, just west of Corpus Christi, became productive for both oil and gas. Since its discovery, it has produced 100 million barrels of oil and a considerable amount of natural gas.
We lived there, and that would be probably 8 miles from Saxet Field, maybe 7. And you could read a newspaper, with the flares were so bright, you could read a newspaper at night with the gas flaring off of the oil. And it went on for months.
Saxett was also the site of 21 blowouts. Enter famous well firefighter Tex Thornton. One well near Corpus Christi blew out and spewed 75 million cubic feet of gas a day for 110 days. Thornton was called, had his wife drive down from Amarillo with a load of nitroglycerin to be used in capping the well. She drove over rough roads at top speed, carrying the equivalent of a 2,000-pound bomb. She scared observers along the way, but arrived at the well site safely, and Thornton capped the well. Blowouts remain a serious threat, and nearly every oil man will tell you a blowout story.
Was in the town side of Sarita. They pulled out a hole to run surface pipe, and the well came in while we were out of the hole. No blowout preventers or nothing. You could see the flame from Kingsville. So that, it was a pretty big fire. Mud and everything had blowed the paint off of the people's houses and scorched their homes. And it was a pretty big mess.
In 1946, prominent oil industry executive Jerry O'Brien, along with his friend Lonnie Glasscock, witnessed one of the most spectacular blowouts ever.
We got within about 4 or 5 miles of that place, and that Saltex well was an explosion. I mean, it was just blowing wild. And it just went wild there. It was it's still a record of a blowout. So there's never been another blowout as big as this one.
Boots and Coots had everything ready to put the fire out, but then the water started coming in, and it started filling up all this land around there and everything, and that kind of shut their operation down, and they went back to Houston without doing any big work. And that well continued to burn for 9 months, 27 days, and some hours. I can't remember the number of hours.
Tom O'Connor comes along, and it's about 10 miles long and 15 miles wide. Again, a colossal lane, and one of the major discoveries of oil in Texas.
Little country towns suddenly were surrounded by oil derricks. And when rough and rowdy men came into town from a day's work, they wanted a good time. The town of Freer, deep in the heart of South Texas, was one of the many towns that answered the call.
The beer joints and gambling hall stayed open all night, and there was a killing every night. Boy, it was a rough, tumble place.
Most of South Texas hadn't changed much from the frontier days. When oil man Tubby Weaver came into a town he hadn't been to before, he wasn't always welcomed with open arms.
He says, "You insulted me." I said, "Man, I didn't insult you. What about it?" He said, "You won't drink." I said, "You a stranger here? I asked you to have a drink with me. You refused me." He said, "You ain't gonna drink with me. I'm gonna whip your ass." So I said, "The hell you are." Well, I thought I was pretty tough in those days. But that guy, I got out of the car and we was having a fist fight right there in the square, just like you seen in the Old West.
Men working the rigs in these parts were a hardy bunch. Not only was rig work dirty and dangerous, but Mother Nature made life even more difficult. It wasn't the 100-degree temperatures or icy winds, it was torrential downpours that left acres of mud to slog through to get to the rig. And if the weather was a nuisance, encountering some of the varmints could be downright dangerous. Roughnecks weren't the only ones with hazardous duty. Landmen and oil operators working on getting property owners to sign leases sometimes faced resistance. During World War II, Tubby Weaver used America's anti-German sentiment as leverage on a prospect.
And she says, well, I'll tell you what I'll do, Mr. Weaver. Says, I'll be standing right there with my rifle. And says, I'll kill you. And I said, your neighbors and all have been so nice about it, and here you stop at a war effort. Now, I'm going to tell you, Ben, you threatened to kill me, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do. I've already been down to the newspaper, and if you stop this pipeline when the plane's been going down, the boys needing diesel fuel coming into Corpus from Almadusa, they can put 3-inch letters in there. And I said, your name, little German name you got, ain't gonna look very good. I said, now you threaten me, I'm telling you, you be in the office there at 9 o'clock in the Driscoll Hotel, or I'm going down to the thing. So I came in and told Jerry Rice, he was head of Tenneco at that time. I said, I don't know what they're gonna do, but I'm not going back out there for $15 a day. I said, you can go if you want to. So she knocked on the door. The girl knocked on the door and said, Miss So-and-so's here with her mother and father, ready to sign. So she came in and said, where are those papers? I said, right, she'll take you. And they got them notarized. She came in there. I still would have wished I'd have bitten her finger off. She put her finger right on it. She says, I'll get even with you one of these days, you son of a bitch.
There was a lady that a friend of mine, John Seibert, who owns a small company in Corpus Christi, when we were up and coming, we went to her house, knocked on her door, and she answered the door, and she had on a nightgown that looked like she'd changed the oil in it, and she had long whiskers that were like curled out 3 or 4 inches, and she had a living room that you walked in, but it was stacked 2 or 3 deep from the floor to the ceiling in old newspapers. 2 rooms of this. And the first thing you noticed when you went in was she had an old mounted deer head above a very narrow fireplace, and over the years the fire had gotten hot and the deer's face had melted down like this, and there was such a stench in that house. When we left, for days and days after, we had that smell in our face, and we ended up having to flip a coin to see who would go back and after get her to sign the lease, but we eventually got it done.
From 1926 until 1945, 4 major events had significant impacts on the development of the oil and gas industry in South Texas. In 1926, when much of the country drove their flivvers and danced to the Charleston, South Texas oil men celebrated the opening of the port of Corpus Christi. Now, oil and gas marketers had a way to ship their products anywhere in the world. The second of these events indirectly affected South Texas, but it can be rightfully considered one of the most significant benefits for the industry in every part of the state. In 1931, soon after Dad Joyner hit a gusher that opened the rich East Texas oil field, the Texas Railroad Commission issued its first ever order limiting the production of oil. The rapid spread of drilling across the area had caused the price of crude to plummet, but the Commission's order was struck down in court. Then in 1933, when the price of oil had sunk to 10 cents a barrel, the courts upheld a new order and the oil and gas industry was saved. Every oil man in the state benefited, and so did other oil-producing countries. when they modeled their own organization after the Texas Railroad Commission.
Well, the Railroad Commission, in some measure, was a model for OPEC. Because, of course, the secret of OPEC's operation, when it's successful, rests on its ability to restrict production. That's what the oil industry in Texas got from the Railroad Commission during the Great Depression. Once all the court cases were settled and the right laws were passed and so on, the commission could tell an operator how much oil he could produce from a given well in a given field during a given month. So it had that kind of control. And we know from the histories written of OPEC by principals in that venture that they looked at the Texas Railroad Commission for at least a decade, trying to see how it worked and if it might work on a larger world scale. So it was the model.
The third of these major events was World War II. The South Texas oil and gas men played an important part in the war effort. Texas provided half of all the oil needed to fuel American and Allied forces' war machines, and South Texas producers supplied a large part of that.
During World War II, the Tom O'Connor field, which was one, I guess, probably the largest oil field in this area at that time, was producing 40,000 barrels of oil a day. The oil was very rich in toluene, which was essential to aviation gasoline, which, of course, there was great demand for in World War II.
Texas oil helped us to win World War II.
Perhaps the most significant contribution was the development of synthetic rubber. When the Japanese conquered Burma, they controlled the entire world's supply of natural rubber. American engineers figured out how to make synthetic rubber from carbon black. It was a complex process which yielded a pound of black from 1,000 cubic feet of natural gas.
One of the major impacts on the industry that came out of World War II in South Texas was the petrochemical industry was kicked off in Corpus Christi in 1943 because of the abundance of natural gas as a very, very cheap feedstock. That was a part of the war effort, but of course it would also be the making of Corpus Christi after that as a processing and transportation center in the region.
The last of these four major events came right after the war. In 1945, Tenneco completed a 1,265-mile-long pipeline that connected South Texas to points east. The new delivery system for natural gas gave area producers access to markets they had only dreamed of before.
So it opened up a demand for geologists, engineers, business people, pipeliners, all manners of technology, all the pipe and valves that had to be made. So it was a very, very important event.
By the time the war ended, the American love affair with the automobile was in full swing. This led to an insatiable demand for oil. In the post-war era, two events ushered in an era of great growth and success in the region's oil and gas industry: the Humble oil deal with the King Ranch and the expansion of offshore drilling.
I think the King Ranch changed everything, yes, sir. Well, the King Ranch area, I'll put it that way, King Ranch area, because it just opened up so many new things.
The King Ranch is the largest privately owned ranch in the country, over 1 million acres. The Clayburghs, owners of the ranch, had resisted oil exploration since a lease to Humble Oil in 1919 resulted in 4 dry holes. But in time, ranching became less profitable, leaving the Clayburghs open to discussing a new lease.
In the early years of the Depression, Henrietta King, really the head of that family, King Ranch family, died. And the family was faced with enormous inheritance taxes in the depth of the Depression. So they needed money at the same time that the Humble Oil and Refining Company in Houston had a lot of money stuffed in the mattress. It had paid off its debts during the 1920s, it had banked money, it had saved up. So when the King Ranch needed money, Humble was there with the only big checkbook remaining in the oil industry. All of the other major companies, like Gulf and Shale, for example, were heavily in debt and were just doing what they could to ride out the Depression.
Negotiations resulted in Humble receiving a lease on the entire ranch acreage in exchange for 1/8 royalty and a 13 cents an acre annual bonus for all 1.1 acres. And to seal the deal, a cash loan to the ranch of over $3 million. Other ranches followed the King's lead and signed leases too.
When things weren't going so good on the surface, they were able to give them, lease the land, give them some bonus money, and save several of the ranches in South Texas from Refugio County on south. All those ranch properties together were 1.8 million acres. That's a lot of land.
The Humble Company alone had over 44 rigs drilling in this South Texas division. They were active all the way from San Antonio to Brownsville, with the major part of the activity being on the King Ranch.
The other major event that led to the heyday of oil and gas production in South Texas was the development of offshore drilling. The early leaders were the Glasscock family and Jimmy Storm. Before World War I, Gus, Lonnie, Mike, and Donley Glasscock were circus performers. The Glasscock family High Wire Act entertained crowds in vaudeville, on Broadway, and at Madison Square Garden before the war broke up the group. After the war, the brothers decided the future lay in the oil business. After a few dry holes, Mike and Donley went another direction, but Gus and Lonnie forged ahead with big dreams of gushers.
Mr. Gus had one daughter, and she was married to Jimmy Storm. And Mr. Gus was the brain, but Jimmy was his son-in-law, and Jimmy took over, Jimmy Storm did, and made a big Gulf show. The offshore stuff started here.
Jimmy Storm, after his beginnings with the Glasscocks, became a major player in offshore drilling.
The Gus 1 was the first offshore jackup rig designed and built by Jimmy Storm, and he built it at Bethlehem Steel in Beaumont. The advantage of the offshore rig, I had previously told you that they had to build a platform and then put the derrick and stuff on the platform and then bring a tender, but they were limited on the depth that they could do it at that time because oil was $3 a barrel. And they were limited cost-wise on building these huge platforms like they do now. So the advantage of the offshore jackup, they could explore a huge area without having to build any infrastructure before they tested the zone whether it was good or not. So the basic thing was it give them a tool to expand fields that were unknown but had potential and not build an infrastructure to drill them. That was Jimmy's idea. And of course it caught on worldwide, quick.
He was a great innovator, and he and his crew had designed a slant rig that was able to reach multi-targets from one location. We were drilling off of jackets offshore, and you couldn't move the rig around, and this slant rig that he came up with allowed him to spin the rig in different directions and
he could reach numerous locations from one location.
After starting with nearshore drilling in shallow water, Storm soon directed his marine drilling company to deepwater drilling far out in the Gulf, usually under contract with major oil companies. He was enormously successful and became instrumental in the development of the port of Corpus Christi. Jimmy Storm was a pillar of the community, generously donating to charities. He was respected by his peers and by those who worked for him.
I never heard him ever say anything about a man negative, never.
With the development on the King and other nearby ranches and offshore drilling, South Texas became a thriving oil and gas center, and Corpus Christi became the hub for much of the activity. The successes of these oil men catapulted some of them onto a larger stage. President John F. Kennedy asked Jerry O'Brien to help craft oil strategies for the government. Once, after a meeting in Geneva where American and Russian delegates argued, O'Brien decided a cocktail party might calm things. He was right. After a time of free-flowing vodka, the Russian delegate invited O'Brien to tour some Russian oil fields. O'Brien was shocked.
I damn near dropped my drink, and I thought, here we'd been fighting, and all of a sudden he's inviting me. I said, my God, there's something funny going on around here. And so I went back and told my German friend about it. And he said, boy, he says, this vodka does wonders, doesn't it? This vodka really does.
The rich Texas oil man is legendary. The fact is, there's truth in the legend. Many real men have reaped enormous gain from their passionate work in the South Texas oil patch. In 1926, just 4 years after entering the oil business, Edgar B. Davis sold his holdings for $12.1 million, the largest transaction in the industry's history up to that time.
Sam Wilson was perhaps the most colorful character. He was a rather large man. He sold one of his properties and he got a check for $2.5 million. And he was so pleased and so surprised that he was showing that to everybody. He stood in what was formerly a drugstore in of the Driscoll Hotel, and everybody that had come through while he was showing that $2.5 million check, which really did set him up.
Paul Haas tells a good story about Sam Wilson, but Haas himself is a legend in South Texas.
We went up to Chicago. We went up there to sell Prado. And we had, whenever we finally got through, they gave Mr. Haas a check for $44 million. A cashier's check. And anyhow, we wanted it because he wanted to get, knowing Mr. Haas financially, he wanted to get that check and get it in the bank the next morning so it could start drawing interest. And so he took a safety pin and pinned a $44 million check right there in that pocket, and we rode all the way home with him with that check in his pocket. And we got out the next morning, and when we deposited in the First State Bank, that was almost twice as much as their total assets.
Oscar Wyatt, founder and CEO of Coastal States Gas Company, was a tough-minded, sometimes controversial figure in the South Texas oil and gas game, but there was never a question about his ability to make money. Wyatt started out in 1950 by taking out an $800 loan, using his Ford car as collateral. Years later, after he'd made Coastal States into a billion-dollar company, he received a gift from Henry Ford, a gold model of a Ford like the one he had used for the loan. With the gift came a note. It was the first time I ever heard of a company started with a Ford. In 1934, Refugio County rancher Tom O'Connor III and Houston oil man Hugh Roy Cullen teamed up to extract huge amounts of oil from beneath O'Connor's property. Both gained enormous wealth from it. O'Connor's and Cullen's good fortune created many jobs in an area hard hit by the Great Depression, and both men contributed significantly to their respective communities, O'Connor in South Texas and Cullen in Houston. The list goes on. More millionaires were made in the South Texas oil patch than can be included in this short program. But together, while they contributed to the rich Texas oil men's legend, their true legacy of civic largesse benefited entire communities in South Texas. Direct contributions have funded numerous charitable activities. This pantheon of oil patch heroes was sprinkled with a few villains, too. One man figured out a way to borrow money on wells that didn't exist.
So here's how he made his money. There was a 4,200-foot sand at Saxit. And he drilled a well down. He had his own drilling rig. He drilled a well. In those days, we put what they call a Christmas tree in the cellar. We could skid the derrick right over the top and put it all down the 4-foot cellar. Later on, you got the big upper one, but we didn't do it in that way in those days. So he drilled a well down. Bill drilled a well down to the 4,200-foot sand. It had some little stringers in it. Then he moved over 100 feet, and he didn't drill a well. He just set the surface pipe, rotate 2 or 3 days, and then he borrowed the money from the bank for that well. But it wasn't any well. He took it. He had a 12-foot on the ground. He had a pipe from this oil well to that oil well. Then he didn't been running. So he had 3 wells right in a row there.
We raised enough money. It was roughly at that time about $40,000. And we got this drilling contractor to drill the well for us. And right as we got totaled up and getting ready to run the log, and we did run the log, he ran off with the money, $40,000, and then he skipped to Mexico, and we hadn't seen him since.
There were even companies spying on each other. Oil field espionage was euphemistically called scouting.
Some people made it a lifelong career, which is fine. But a scout, they had territories, and sometimes people try to hold it secret, so you'd park way out on the road someplace with glasses and see how many pieces of drill stem they pulled out, and you say, well, there's 6,000 feet today. And well, there's all sorts of shenanigans to get information.
And one of the methods that the oil scouts used was they carried a ice box, portable ice box. You put ice in it and whatever, and they would put liquor in that ice box, and they would go out and find maybe the tool pusher or the driller or something on a drilling rig, or one of the field men on a seismograph crew, and they'd give him a bottle of liquor to try to get him to tell them what they wanted to know about the oil, what they were doing in the oil patch, and then they could report that back.
Despite the few bad apples and the entry into the business of some misfits, for most, the South Texas oil and gas heyday from the 1950s until the 1980s was an exciting and profitable time. But nothing lasts forever. The good times ended abruptly in 1982.
We were going great guns until about 82, and the price went from $40 a barrel to $10 overnight.
A friend of mine named Art Chapey, who was an old oil finder here in South Texas, came into my office and said, the boom's over. And I kind of looked at him like, what the heck are you talking about, the boom's over? Here I am in my office and everything's been fabulous. And he said, no, the boom's over. The price of oil just went and crashed down and the boom's over.
The end of an era naturally brought change, and a new breed of independent oil man, not unlike the early wildcatters.
The majors start going overseas because they, in order to survive, they've got to find major oil fields. They didn't feel like they could find a major oil field in South Texas, so they basically pulled out, and that opened up opportunities for independence.
A lot of small operators can come in and do their own gauging and pumping and all that and make a lot of money.
In the last few decades, technological innovation has improved methods of finding, extracting, and transporting product. One is 3D seismic.
3D seismic is a brand new technology that came out about 15, 20 years ago, used by the majors, and now independent geologists are able to use it by using PC computers.
In the 70s, Bill and I's generation were the top people. We knew what was going on, or we understood the geology and the exploration business as it was known in the 70s. We basically missed the 80s, but Bob Rollings got together with all the 2D seismic and bought all that data, and they were the masters of the 80s, which so was Bill Maxwell and that group at Harkins. So then come the 90s, I figured this time we need to move to the next stage, which is 3D. And that enabled my technical staff to move into the 90s.
Over the years, the direction that geophysics has gone is from a more mathematical analysis of what happens underneath the Earth's surface to looking at the seismic data and trying to extract the geology directly from what we see. And we take the geologic concepts that we know and understand much better than the earlier geophysicists, and we apply what we pull out of the data, the information that we extract from the data, and apply that to our geologic knowledge, and basically try to geologically understand what is happening 2 and 3 miles beneath the surface of the Earth. And we do a much better job of doing that today with the use of 3D geophysics than could ever be done with 2D.
Modern equipment has just improved tremendously. The biggest part of the improvements that I've seen has been in the bits. They have now what they call a PDC bit, or ugly bit, what they call. It has no moving parts.
With improving technology, was a great boon for the oil business, because that was one area where best practices increased the percentage of the oil in place that you could recover.
Today, oil and gas men are watching a new star on the horizon. Advanced drilling technology has opened up major opportunities in exploration of the Eagle Ford Shale formation, a rich reservoir of oil and gas spread under a broad band of South Texas real estate.
Any objective analysis of the origins of Eagle Ford would have to say it's been there for a long, long time. We've known that the shale deposits were there, but it took the development of the fracturing technology to go down 2 miles, then take a horizontal turn, which technologically is very tough to do, and then figure out how to fracture the shale rock to extract the oil and gas that is in there and bring it back out. Massively expensive technology, which leads to the second point, which is oil and gas prices had to get to a particular point, a level, which makes it economic to do this and have it be competitive price-wise per barrel of oil or per cubic foot of gas.
So that's why you've seen the Exxons come back. You have the foreign companies in here. You have Talisman, which is Canadian. You've got Statoil, which is Norwegian, starting up.
Eagle Ford was a new play, so it allowed us to get into it relatively inexpensive, and we were ready to jump on it early, so we got in at the very early part of the Eagle Ford Shale leasing, and so we're able to capitalize on a lower cost entry, and that's made the shale far more profitable for us.
We've drilled 117 wells thus far in the Eagle Ford. We've got about 85 of them on production, and we have 10 rigs running.
The rigs now have systems that you walk the rig from well to well with that no one would ever have thought you'd seen, where we used to get cranes and drag them with trucks, and now we pick up the whole rig and it walks to the next well. And you're doing this in a matter of 3.5, 4 hours, and you're drilling another well again.
Although production began just a few years ago, numerous wells are already dominating much of the landscape across this 400-mile-long strip. Newly enriched farmers and ranchers are celebrating in formerly poor towns like Dilley, Cotulla, Carrizo Springs, and others across the breadth of the Eagle Ford area.
To get this kind of economic infusion is nothing less than manna from heaven. This is the moment that we've been dreaming about but never imagined could happen. And to the degree that we're taking one of the poorest regions in the country and lifting its capabilities, then everybody benefits.
The potential for great economic gains based on production from the Eagle Ford Shale formation has many South Texans excited, while some in the industry are casting a wary eye. Environmental concerns have been raised, but so far at least, they have been manageable.
All of these, I think, can be addressed. First of all, the environmental issues require transparency on the part of the companies. They require a good regulatory framework. And I think Texas, because we have the Railroad Commission, because we have a long history of regulating oil and gas operations, Texas is better off than other parts of the country that are just coming to a recognition of the potential, negative potential, of oil and gas operations.
Other threats to the future of South Texas oil may overshadow any stiffened regulations on shale drilling. With increasing pressures from environmentalists and government, alternative fuels are slowly making inroads into energy markets.
This is long-term employment. This is long-term future for what we're going to have.
The men chiefly responsible for these amazing achievements were men of strength and determination. Men who, in the face of great odds and in challenging circumstances, gave South Texas a firm economic foundation. These were the South Texas Oil and Gas Men.
For more on the history of the oil and gas industry in South Texas, read Wooden Rigs, Iron Men, available from the Corpus Christi Geological Society.